the last of the Mohicans, James Fenimore Copper.
Preface. The Last of the Mohicans takes place during the French and Indian Wars fought between 1756 and 1763 in the area that is now the eastern part of the border between the United States of America and Canada. The army of the French king wanted to stop the English settlers from moving into the wilderness areas, which were important to the French fur trade. These wars between the English and the French forces, each with their Indian allies, were one of the most savage chapters in American history. Chapter 1. The Shortcut to the Fort. At Fort Edward, on the edge of the dense forests of New York State, two men stood near a small group of horses. One of the men was tall and thin, with a big head, long arms, and long, thin legs. He wore a blue coat and held a Bible in his hand. The other man was an Indian. He had a fierce expression. The war paint on his dark face made him look even fiercer. He was armed with a tomahawk and a knife, as well as the short rifle that the English gave to their Indian allies. The two men watched as hundreds of soldiers and settlers rode past them down a track and went into the forest. At that moment, Duncan Hayward, a handsome young English officer in a red uniform, approached the two men. There were two elegant young ladies with him. The young officer helped the ladies onto their horses. The younger woman's veil blew aside, revealing a clear complexion, golden hair, blue eyes, and an animated smile. The other young woman seemed to be a little more mature, with thick black hair, a dark complexion, and beautiful white teeth. "Let's go!" shouted Duncan. The man with the Bible watched as Duncan and the two women followed the other soldiers down the track into the forest. The Indian with the war paint ran next to them. He was their guide. This small group and the rest of the English soldiers were on their way to Fort William Henry. The fort's commander, Colonel Monroe, needed reinforcements from General Webb at Fort Edward to help him fight the French forces, who were commanded by General Montcalm. The two women were Colonel Monroe's daughters, and Duncan Hayward was taking them to their father. Magua, their Indian guide, would take them by a shortcut through the forest so that they would arrive at Fort William Henry before the soldiers and settlers. After they had ridden for several hours, Magua indicated a narrow track that went into the forest. It was so narrow that they had to ride along it in single file. Alice, the younger of the two women, turned to her older sister, Cora, and said, "I don't like the look of our Indian guide. Perhaps it would be safer to travel with the soldiers, even though it might take a little longer." Duncan reassured her. "There is more danger of attack if we ride with the soldiers. Their route is known, but ours is a secret. Your father knows Magua well, and I am sure we can trust him. We should not distrust the Indian just because his skin is dark and his manners are different," added Cora. "If he knows our father, he is sure to be a friend to us." The small group continued slowly along the track. Then Duncan heard the noise of a horse behind them. He turned around and saw the man with the Bible. "I hope that you are not bringing us bad news," Duncan said. "Not at all," the man replied. "I know you are riding to Fort William Henry, and I thought we would be good company for each other. We can sing psalms to pass the time." "This man is a musician, Duncan," laughed Alice. "His name is David Gamet. Let him come with us, please. He amuses me, and he may be a friend in time of need." When Duncan agreed, David blew a note on a flute and began to sing. Magua immediately went to Duncan and spoke quietly to him. The young officer then turned to David and said, "Magua says that we must go as quietly as possible. Please do not sing until we reach the safety of the fort." As he was speaking, Duncan thought he saw something shining in the bushes beside the track. He laughed at himself for being so nervous. As the group disappeared down the track, an Indian with war paint on his face moved out from behind the trees. With a triumphant look on his face, he followed them. Other Indians who were hiding along the track also began to move through the forest after them. Chapter 2. Hawkeye and the Mohicans. In a nearby part of the forest, two men sat by a stream. The birds sang in the treetops around them. One of the men, an Indian in black and white body paint, sat on the end of a fallen tree. His head was shaved except for one tuft of hair. This hair was decorated with a single eagle feather. The Indian carried a tomahawk, a scalping knife, and a short military rifle. He was debating with the white man next to him. Hawkeye, the white man, was dressed in a green shirt. He was wearing a hat made of animal skins and a wide belt. His shoes were decorated in the Indian style, and he wore deerskin trousers tied at the knees. He carried a knife, but no tomahawk, and beside him there was a long hunting rifle. "Chingachgook," said Hawkeye, "your people came from the west of the Mississippi River and took the land. My people, the white men, came from the east and took the land from your people. Let God be the judge. We should not waste time arguing about the justice of it. Hawkeye, my ancestors and their enemies fought one another with stone arrows. Your people used rifles with lead bullets," Chingachgook replied. "There is truth in what you say," said Hawkeye. "My people do many things that do not seem reasonable to me. Then they write their lies in books so that no one can argue with them and make them tell the truth." Chingachgook looked solemn for a moment and then answered, "Listen, Hawkeye, and I will tell you the truth. We came from the place where the sun is hidden at night until we reached the big river. There we fought our enemies until the ground was red with their blood. The land all around us was ours. We took it like warriors, and we kept it like men. When other tribes tried to defeat us, we sent them into the forest with the bears." "I have heard all this before, Chingachgook," answered Hawkeye. "What happened next?" "The first palefaces who came here were Dutch," Chingachgook continued. "At that time, we lived next to the great water that you call the Atlantic Ocean. We were one people, and we were happy. The salt lakes gave us their fish, the forests gave us deer, the sky gave us birds, and our wives gave us children. We worshipped the Great Spirit, and we kept our enemies far from us." "Do you know anything about your own family at that time?" asked Hawkeye. "You are a noble man, and I am sure that your ancestors were brave warriors and wise leaders." Chingachgook answered, "My tribe is the grandfather of nations. I have the blood of chiefs in me, but my people have lost their land, first to the Dutch and then to the English. Although I am a chief, I have always lived in the forest. I have never returned to the great water to see the tombs of my ancestors. One by one, the people in my family have departed to the land of the spirits. I am on the hilltop of my life, and I must go down into the valley. When Uncas, my son, follows me, there will be no one left. Uncas is the last of the Mohicans." "I, Uncas, am here," said a young Indian to the two men as he sat down near them. Chingachgook turned to his son. "Did you follow that Iroquois war party to see who they are looking for?" he asked. "There are 10 of them hiding like cowards. Perhaps they are preparing an ambush," said Uncas. "An ambush!" exclaimed Hawkeye. They are probably spies for our enemy, General Montcalm. Enough, said Chingachgook. Tonight we will eat. We have plenty of time tomorrow to fight the Iroquois and show them that we are men. The three men talked for a while. Then suddenly, Hawkeye shouted, Look behind that bush, Uncas. That is the biggest deer I have seen this year. I will hit it between the eyes, closer to the right eye than to the left eye. Hawkeye, do you want to fight the Iroquois today? If they hear the sound of your rifle, they will be the ones to eat the deer you shoot, said Uncas. Hawkeye nodded. You are right. I must leave the deer to your arrow, Uncas. Uncas picked up a bow, pulled it back, and shot an arrow. The deer jumped as the arrow hit it, and then fell to the ground. Uncas ran to the deer and cut its throat. That was a good shot, said Hawkeye admiringly. Suddenly, Chingachgook stood up and turned toward the forest. The horses of white men are coming, he said. Hawkeye, speak to them. I shall, said Hawkeye. I only hope the Iroquois do not find them first. Chapter 3. Meeting in the Forest. The four riders and Magua came into the clearing in the forest where Hawkeye stood next to the dead deer. Uncas and Chingachgook were out of sight, with their weapons ready. Who is there? Asked Hawkeye. Believers in God and friends of the king, looking for Fort William Henry, Duncan answered. You are lost then, said Hawkeye. Didn't you know whether to take the right or the left turn? We are like babies. We depend on those who guide us. Do you know how far it is to the fort? Duncan asked. It is a long way from here, said Hawkeye. You must have lost your eyesight before you lost the trail. There is a wide, clearly marked trail to Fort William Henry. We have an Indian guide with us. We trusted him to show us a shortcut, but he seems to be lost. We do not know where we are, answered the young officer. That is strange indeed, an Indian lost in the forest. Who is he? Asked Hawkeye. He was adopted by the Mohawks, but he was born a Huron, answered Duncan. A Huron, exclaimed Hawkeye in disgust. They are all liars and thieves. I'm not surprised you are lost if a Huron is guiding you. Our guide now serves the English, Duncan replied. I don't believe it, said Hawkeye. You cannot tell me about a man I know and you do not know. Now answer me. How far are we from Fort William Henry? Duncan asked impatiently. That depends on who your guide is, Hawkeye answered. If you will guide us to the fort, I promise you a reward, said the young officer. How do I know that you are not a spy for the French? Asked Hawkeye. Not everyone who speaks English is a loyal subject. Do you know Major Effingham of the 60th Regiment? Asked Duncan. Of course, I know him well, exclaimed Hawkeye. I am Major Hayward of the same regiment, Duncan continued. I am taking these two ladies to their father, Colonel Monroe, at Fort William Henry. We cannot reach the fort before dark, said Hawkeye. The woods are full of Iroquois. They are our enemies. At that moment, Magua came forward. Magua, we are lost, said Duncan. Night is coming and the ladies are tired. We are still far from Fort William Henry, and this hunter says that there is a war party of Iroquois nearby. He will show us a safe place to camp and will take us to the fort in the morning. Is he alone? Magua asked with a strange look. Alone? Asked Duncan. No, we are with him. I, the clever fox, will leave you, said Magua. Then you will be with only those of your own color. Who is the clever fox? Asked Duncan. It is the name the French gave to me, said Magua. And are you going to tell Colonel Monroe that you left his daughters in the forest after you promised to guide them? Duncan asked. I don't have to tell Monroe anything, Magua answered. The Mohawks will make a dress for you and say you are a woman because you cannot be trusted with a man's business, replied Duncan. I don't need to return to the Mohawks, Magua answered. I can find my way to the Great Lakes and return to my own people, the Hurons." "Enough, Magua," said Duncan. "Why should we argue? Monroe has promised you a reward for bringing his daughter safely to him. Rest now and eat." "The white men act like dogs for their women," said Magua to himself in his own language. "When I have these women in my own home, I will teach them to know their place." "What are you saying, Magua?" asked Duncan. "I said that I agreed to stay," Magua answered. As Duncan turned away, Magua's hand moved toward the tomahawk in his belt. Seeing this, Hawkeye lifted his rifle and fired. The bullet just missed Magua and hit a tree behind him. Magua ran into the forest. Chingachgook and Uncas jumped up and ran after him as Hawkeye fired again. A few minutes later, the three men returned. "Who are the men with you?" Duncan asked Hawkeye. "They are Mohicans, Chingachgook and Uncas his son. They are friends to me, and they will be friends to you too," Hawkeye replied. "But why did you let Magua escape?" Duncan asked. "We can't waste time chasing him," said Hawkeye. "We must reach our camp before dark, or the Iroquois will have our scalps and sell them to Montcalm before morning." "For God's sake, help me to protect these young women!" exclaimed Duncan. "We will," said Hawkeye. "But first, you must promise two things. First, whatever happens, you must be as silent as this sleeping forest. Second, you must always keep secret the place where we are going to take you." "We agree," answered Duncan. "Hide the horses here and then follow me," said Hawkeye to the Mohicans. "Come." Duncan, Alice, Cora, and David did as he said. Soon they reached the edge of a river. Hawkeye pushed back the branches of a tree and revealed a canoe. The five companions got into it, and Hawkeye guided it up the river. Eventually they came to a place where the river was broken by a high waterfall. Hawkeye directed the canoe toward a small island in front of the waterfall. "Where are we?" asked Duncan. "We're at the foot of Glenn's Falls," answered Hawkeye. "Get out now and I will return for the Mohicans and some food." Hawkeye soon returned with Uncas and Chingachgook. They took the things from the canoe that they needed to make camp and then seemed to disappear into a rock wall. Duncan Hayward, the two sisters, and David Gamut looked at each other in astonishment. A few minutes later, Uncas returned and guided them behind the waterfall to some caves. Chapter 4. Hiding in the Cave. "Now we have protection, provisions, and defenders," said Duncan cheerfully. "Whatever Montcalm tries, we are ready." Then he turned to Hawkeye and asked, "Did you see any Iroquois when you went out in the canoe?" "No, but I know they are there," answered Hawkeye. "An Indian must be felt before he is seen. We must be careful not to give any sign that we are here. Wolves often stay near an encampment hoping to find scraps of food. The Iroquois also know that the howling of a wolf means there are people and food nearby." Uncas now made a small fire and prepared food. Alice had the opportunity to see how handsome and strong the younger Mohican was. She turned to Duncan and whispered, "I cannot believe that such a fearless and generous man as Uncas could do the terrible things that we hear and read about." "You are right about Uncas, but don't forget that noble qualities are rare in any race," answered Duncan. "It is the French and we English who have introduced one of the cruelest customs in this war, the taking of scalps. Both sides pay their Indian allies by the number of enemies they have killed. The scalps are cut from the heads of men, women, and children, both whites and Indians, for money. Much of the money is spent on whiskey, which is ruining entire tribes." At that moment, Chingachgook came out of the shadows behind them. He had come through another entrance at the back of the cave. Alice and her sister gave a cry of surprise. Hawkeye laughed. "Don't worry," he said. "Chingachgook, Uncas, and I are like good foxes. We won't be caught in a place with only one exit." When the food was cooked, everyone sat down to eat. Duncan was interested to see that Uncas tried to help the two sisters in small ways, although according to Indian custom, warriors do not do any type of work to help women. Duncan could also see that while Uncas was kind to both women, he spent more time looking into the face of the older one, Cora, as she spoke. He also observed that the ladies were charmed by the deep musical quality of Uncas's voice when he spoke to them. Chingachgook sat near the fire, and the sisters were now able to see that Uncas looked like his father under his war paint. They also noticed that Chingachgook often paused while eating and listened to some distant sound outside the cave. This reminded them that they were still in very real danger. Cora turned to Hawkeye and said, "Pardon me for asking so directly, but how is it that you have learned so much about Indian ways and even speak their language?" Hawkeye thought about her question for a moment before beginning his answer. "I suppose to ladies like you and your sister it must seem strange, but my story is simple. My parents came to these new lands, and I passed my early years in the frontier settlements. My parents took land and cut and cleared the forest to make a garden. They both became ill and died when I was only 6 years old, and I was left alone in the forest. Chingachgook found me and raised me as his own son. He has been a father to me, and Uncas has been my brother. Chingachgook taught us about hunting and the forest and the wisdom of the Indians. When we were older, he sent us to a missionary school so that we could learn the language of the white man and his way of thinking. But in most things, I still think and act like an Indian." Hawkeye was also sitting next to David Gamut. When he had answered Cora, he started to talk to David for the first time. Hawkeye took out a bottle of whiskey, offered it to David, and asked, "What is your name, friend?" "Gamut. David Gamut," answered the musician as he took the bottle and drank. It is a very good name," said Hawkeye. "I am an admirer of names, although I like the Indian fashion in names more. Indian names are more honest than ours and reflect the person's nature. Did you know that Chingachgook means the Great Serpent? It means that he understands the turnings of human nature. He is silent, and he attacks his enemies when they least expect it. Tell me, sir, what do you do in life?" "I am a singing teacher for the young people in the settlements," answered David. "Really?" exclaimed Hawkeye. "And can you shoot a rifle?" "Thanks be to God, I have never used a murderous thing like a rifle," David answered. "Perhaps you are good with a compass and maps?" asked Hawkeye. "I don't know anything about them either," said David. "I have no profession or business except teaching sacred music." "Why don't you sing for us now?" said Hawkeye. "It will be a friendly way to say good night, and these ladies must be very tired. They will need strength for a long, hard journey to the fort in the morning." "I will happily sing," exclaimed David. "It is right to praise God after a day of terrible danger." Alice and Cora joined David as he sang a slow, solemn hymn. The others listened quietly. The song brought tears to Hawkeye's eyes as he remembered his days as a boy in the settlements. Suddenly, they were interrupted by an inhuman cry from outside the cave. "Was that the shout an Indian makes to frighten his enemies?" asked Cora. "No. When you hear that shout, you will never mistake it for any other sound," answered Hawkeye. "Don't worry. Go deeper into the cave and try to sleep." "How can we sleep knowing how worried Father must be?" asked Cora. "It was selfish of us to try to visit him when there is so much danger." "He was pleased and proud when he heard that you were coming," Duncan assured them. But the rest of his speech was interrupted by the same horrible cry as before. Hawkeye went to the entrance of the cave as the others stood looking at one another in terror. Chapter 5. The Battle at the Cave. "Major Hayward, come outside and help us watch," Hawkeye said. Let the ladies and David stay inside. These cries certainly mean some kind of danger. The same sound echoed through the forest again. It sounds like something from another world, said Hawkeye. I know this cry from the field of battle, said Duncan. It is the horrid cry a horse gives either in agony or in terror. I think I can also hear wolves. Yes, said Hawkeye. They must be near our horses. Uncas, take a branch from the fire and try to frighten them away, or we will have no horses in the morning. Before Uncas could move, however, the howls of the wolves became more distant. They were moving away through the forest. Hawkeye and the Mohicans spoke quietly for a few minutes, and then Hawkeye turned to Duncan. We'll sit here in the shadows and wait for whoever has frightened away those wolves, he said. The men sat silently watching the trees, while Alice, Cora, and David fell asleep. Eventually, Duncan also slept. Only Hawkeye and the two Mohicans continued to watch through the night. At dawn, Hawkeye moved over to Duncan and woke him. Now is the time to start our journey, he whispered. Wake the others, and I will bring the canoe. Suddenly, the forest was filled with cries and shouts. Shots flew from a dozen rifles. The Mohicans shouted their war cries, and a scream signaled that Hawkeye's rifle had found a victim. Duncan grabbed David and pulled him deeper into the cave. Soon the forest was as silent as before the attack. Do you think they will attack again? Duncan asked Hawkeye. They have lost a man, but they will come again, said Hawkeye. I am sure that Colonel Monroe will send help soon, Duncan said. Then he, Hawkeye, and the Mohicans looked out into the forest around them. We don't know which direction the Iroquois will come from, Hawkeye said. Let's stay hidden and wait for them to return. The Mohicans hid themselves behind the rocks. Hawkeye went to the center of the small island, where there were several small pine trees. Duncan ran after him. David and the two women stayed in the cave. As the sun rose, Duncan and Hawkeye were able to see the forest more clearly. Duncan was convinced that the Iroquois had gone. Hawkeye laughed at the idea. The Iroquois will not leave without a scalp, he said. There were at least 40 of them, and they know that we are only a few people. Look at the water over there. Do you see them? They have swum to our island. Stay down or they will have your scalp. Duncan looked closely and saw the heads of 4 Iroquois above a floating tree trunk. Hawkeye gave a long whistle that brought Uncas silently to his side. Uncas indicated where the 4 Iroquois were hiding. I see them, Uncas. I see them, said Hawkeye. They are preparing to attack. Well, let them come. We are ready for them. At that moment, the forest filled with shouts from the Iroquois. At the signal, the 4 Indians came out from the cover of the trunk. Duncan wanted to run forward to meet them, but Uncas stopped him. When the Iroquois jumped over some black rocks and came toward them, Hawkeye slowly stood up and fired his rifle. The first Iroquois fell onto the rocks. Now, Uncas, cried Hawkeye. Kill one of them. Duncan and I will take care of the other 2. Uncas obeyed and quickly killed his opponent. Hawkeye and Duncan both shot at the Iroquois but didn't hit them. One of the Iroquois grabbed Duncan and started to fight with him. Then, Uncas came from behind the Iroquois and cut his throat. At the same time, Hawkeye managed to take out a knife and kill the Indian who attacked him. To cover! To cover! Cried Hawkeye. To cover! Run for your lives! We haven't finished them yet! Uncas gave a shout of triumph, and the 3 men ran to the cover of the pine trees. Chapter 6. Magua's Prisoners. Hawkeye's call to take cover was answered by a fierce shout from the enemy and more shots. One shot came very close to Duncan, who exclaimed, "That bullet was better aimed than usual." Hawkeye examined the flattened metal and said, This bullet came from above. Uncas raised his rifle and pointed it at a tree on the other side of the river, nearly opposite from their hiding place. An Iroquois was lying on a branch near the top of the tree, partly hidden and partly exposed. "Uncas," whispered Hawkeye, "we'll shoot from both sides of the tree at the same time." At Hawkeye's signal, they both fired. But the Iroquois simply laughed and fired at them again. The bullet cut through Duncan's red uniform. Eventually, the Iroquois exposed his body to the waiting rifles. Hawkeye and Uncas fired together. This time they hit their target. The Iroquois grabbed desperately at one of the branches. He hung above the river until at last he lost all strength and fell into the water. There was no time to relax, though. At that moment, another Iroquois swam to Hawkeye's canoe and untied it. The canoe disappeared down the river. "What is going to happen now?" Duncan demanded. "The rest of our food and ammunition were in that canoe." "Our situation is hopeless," said Hawkeye, and he made a sign around the hair on the top of his head to indicate scalping. "But surely we can keep the Iroquois off the island," exclaimed the young major. "With what?" asked Hawkeye. "It is only a matter of time before we all die. It may be minutes, or it may be an hour before they attack again, and then we have no hope." Chingachgook spoke. His words were like a chant. "Let them bring their sharpest knives. Today they face their worst enemy, Chingachgook, the great serpent," he said. Uncas joined in the chant. "May they look among the fish of the river for their dead," he said. Hawkeye said, "You two will provoke the Iroquois to kill you quickly with these words." "Why must you die?" asked Cora, coming carefully out of the cave. "The path is open. You can easily escape." "The only way open is down the river," said Hawkeye. "The Iroquois have not left any path open to the forest." "Then try the river. Don't stay here and wait to be victims of the Iroquois," said Cora. "The Iroquois will not kill defenseless women, so leave us here." "It is better for a man to die fighting and be at peace with himself than for him to live with a bad conscience," Hawkeye answered. "What will we say to your father when he asks where his daughters are?" "Say that you left them as prisoners of the Iroquois and that you will help him to follow and rescue them," Cora said. "That's a good idea," said Hawkeye. "You must break the bushes to mark your trail when the Iroquois capture you, and we will come after you, even to the ends of the earth." He turned and spoke to the Mohicans. Chingachgook agreed with the idea, but Uncas was unhappy. He looked at Cora. "I will stay," he said quietly to Hawkeye. "You will help her more if you come with us," Hawkeye replied. "We can return to save her and the others when the Iroquois are not expecting us." Uncas thought for a few moments. He and Cora looked at one another. Then Uncas nodded his head in agreement and followed the other two men into the water. "Follow them, Duncan," said Cora. "I have often heard of your skill in the water. You will serve us better if you live and help to rescue us than if you stay and die." "I cannot possibly leave you both, Cora," said Duncan. "I don't see any Iroquois," he said, turning to David Gamut. "Let's hide in the cave and hope that they don't find us." Duncan pulled David into the inner part of the cave with the sisters and covered the opening with pine branches. They waited silently for a long time. After what seemed to be an eternity, David began to sing a soft hymn. Duncan did not object, as he was sure that David could not be heard above the noise of the waterfall. But as the song ended, they heard wild shouts from the entrance to the cave. "We are lost!" screamed Alice. "Not yet, not yet," Duncan reassured her. The shouts came closer. The Iroquois were in the cave. They moved around quickly, exploring the cave and looking through the things which Hawkeye and the Mohicans had abandoned there. Then they left without discovering the inner cave where Duncan, David, and the sisters were hiding. As Alice turned to embrace her sister, her face turned pale with terror. Magua was standing at the back entrance to the cave. At first he could not see them. The bright light from outside blinded him for a few moments in the darkness of the cave. Duncan raised his pistol and fired at Magua, but missed. The Indian gave a loud cry that brought the rest of the enemy into the cave from both entrances. Duncan, David, Cora, and Alice were surrounded by Iroquois and taken outside into the light of day. There, the Indians tied ropes around their necks and tied their hands in front of them. The Iroquois returned to the cave, but Magua remained outside. Finally, Duncan turned to him and said, "Magua, you traitor, what are your warriors looking for?" "I will tell you," said Magua. "They are looking for Hawkeye, who the French named the Long Rifle. His rifle is good, and his eye never closes. We want his scalp as well as those of our other enemies." "He has escaped down the river," said Duncan. "You will not find him." "Why didn't you escape with him?" asked Magua. "I did not want to leave the women," said Duncan. "And where is the Mohican, the great serpent, and his son, the agile deer?" demanded Magua. "You mean Chingachgook and his son Uncas? They have escaped too," answered Duncan. Magua told his men that the enemies they were looking for had escaped down the river. When the warriors heard this, some of them ran to the edge of the river and shouted. Others came toward the four captives. One grabbed Alice by her long curly hair and motioned around her scalp with his knife. Then Magua gave the order to move. He and 6 warriors led the captives to the upper part of the island, next to the waterfall. The captives were forced into canoes. Duncan realized that the Indians were not taking them to Montcalm to be exchanged for money, and he became very worried. They traveled by canoe for some distance until they reached the place where the Indians had tied some horses. Then they left the canoes and traveled on horseback. Cora tried to leave signs as Hawkeye had instructed her, but she was watched carefully by a big Iroquois who put his hand to his tomahawk when he saw her try to break a branch. After a while, the Iroquois stopped to rest in a clearing. Magua lay down under a tree a short distance from the rest of the group. Duncan went to him. "Magua, Colonel Monroe will give you a great reward for the return of his daughters," Duncan began. "What will you give for your life?" Magua asked Duncan. "I know that you love whiskey," said Duncan, "and I can give you all the whiskey you want." Magua listened to Duncan's words seriously, and then answered, "Go. Be silent. I will tell you what I want when I am ready." They continued to travel quickly, sometimes on horseback and sometimes on foot until late in the afternoon. When they stopped to rest, Magua sat some distance from the others against a tree. Duncan went to him and asked what he had decided about the offer of a reward. Magua began, "Do the white men love their children?" "Of course," Duncan replied. "All men love their children." "Does the heart of Colonel Monroe grow soft when he thinks of his daughters?" Magua continued. "He is cold and hard as stone with his warriors." "Certainly. He will pay you a great reward to have them returned to him safely," Duncan responded. "He is a very loving father." "Go and tell the dark-haired woman that I want to speak to her," said Magua. Duncan told Cora to promise guns, blankets, and whiskey for their freedom, and he took her to Magua. Magua signaled Duncan to go away, and he spoke directly to Cora. "Listen," Magua began. "I am a chief and a warrior. I lived for 20 summers before I saw a white man for the first time, and I was happy. Then the French came to the forest and taught me to drink whiskey. I drank too much, and my people sent me away from my village to the French fort on the lake. There I had more problems, and they sent me away through the forest into the arms of my enemies, the Mohawks. First I was their slave, but now they have adopted me as a warrior." "I have heard something of this before," said Cora, "but you cannot punish me for that. It is not my fault." I am not stupid, Magua went on. When the French and the English began their war, I, Magua, and the Mohawks helped the English fight against my own people, the Hurons. Your father made a law that if the Mohawks drank whiskey and then came into the camp, they would be punished. I was a fool. I drank whiskey and then went to see your father. What did your father do? Can you say? He did not forget his words, replied Cora, and he punished you. A strange light came into Magua's eyes. Your father had me tied up like a dog and whipped in front of all his soldiers. See, said Magua, pulling aside the shirt that covered his chest. Here on my body are the marks of a warrior from bullets and knives, but here on my back are the marks of shame made by your father. It is possible that my father was unfair to you, but if you can show him that a chief does not take his vengeance on innocent women, he will reward you as Major Hayward says, said Cora. Magua shook his head. What do you want then? Continued Cora after a pause. Justice, said Magua. Good for good, and bad for bad. Do you want to punish my father's daughters for what he has done? Asked Cora. Your sister and the 2 men can return to your father, Magua said, but you must come with me and live as my wife with my people. There can be no pleasure in sharing your home with a wife who does not love you, Cora replied. Take my father's gold and buy the heart of a Huron woman. Magua took a step nearer to Cora and said, No, you will come with me. That is my vengeance on your father. His heart will ache when he knows that his daughter is always in reach of my anger. Monster, cried Cora. I will never agree to this. Magua only smiled and motioned her to go away. He then walked to the Iroquois and began to speak to them. They became more and more excited as he continued. When he finished speaking, they were all on their feet. The Iroquois began to tie the 4 prisoners to trees and to put wood at their feet to make a fire. Duncan and David tried to resist, but it was impossible. All 4 were tied to trees. Suddenly they heard a shot, and one of the Iroquois fell to the ground dead. Hawkeye, Uncas, and Chingachgook ran into the clearing. It took the Iroquois only a moment to react to the attack. Magua pulled out his knife and ran at Chingachgook. The 2 warriors wrestled with each other as the fighting raged around them. At the same time, Duncan managed to free himself and grabbed one of Magua's weapons from under a tree. But Duncan did not see an Iroquois approaching him with a knife in his hand. Major Hayward, be careful, cried Hawkeye. As Duncan turned around in horror, Hawkeye ran to the Iroquois and knocked him to the ground with his rifle. Meanwhile, Uncas had killed several Iroquois with his tomahawk. Suddenly, he saw an Iroquois moving toward Cora. Uncas threw his tomahawk to cut the ropes that held her to the tree. Cora ran to her sister Alice and freed her, but the Iroquois moved toward her again. He grabbed Cora by her long hair and forced her to her knees. As the Iroquois raised his knife to Cora's head, Uncas leaped through the air and plunged his knife into the chest of his enemy. Nearby, Chingachgook and Magua were still fighting. Finally, Magua was knocked to the ground by Chingachgook, but he still managed to escape into the forest. The rest of Magua's war party lay dead in the clearing. Duncan ran to Alice's side. She was crying and he put his arms around her to comfort her. Uncas, bloodstained from the combat, went to Cora. You saved my life. Thank you, said Cora. They looked at one another for a long moment, and then Uncas helped Cora to stand. Hawkeye went to free David, while Chingachgook moved among the bodies of their enemies, making certain that they were dead. Chapter 7. The Siege of Fort William Henry. Hawkeye took the small group into the forest, following a river. As evening came, they arrived at a small hill. On the hill was a fort which had been built for a battle a long time ago. Few people know that this old fort is here, said Hawkeye. The Mohicans and their enemies fought here a long time ago for 40 days and 40 nights. I buried the dead with my own hands, here where we are standing. But don't worry, they cannot harm us, and they are safe from any harm that we could do to them. Uncas, Duncan, and David helped to find branches for the two sisters to sleep on. Then, while the others slept, Chingachgook sat looking out over the forest. Several hours later, Chingachgook heard footsteps, and he woke Hawkeye, Duncan, and Uncas. "Take the horses into the fort," Hawkeye whispered to Duncan. "Keep everything in the shadows. Our enemies may pass us in the darkness without seeing us." The sound of footsteps came nearer and nearer, then stopped. Chingachgook and Hawkeye listened to voices speaking rapidly in French and in the language of the Iroquois. "I hear Magua's voice," said Hawkeye. "The traitor has found some of Montcalm's soldiers and they are looking for us." As he said this, they heard the footsteps move away into the forest. "Why are they leaving?" asked Duncan. "They respect the dead who lie here. They will come no closer," answered Hawkeye. He woke the small group and took them quietly through the forest in the opposite direction. Eventually, they came to a lake called the Bloody Lake. It had this name because people thought that the spirits of the dead lived in it. As they went slowly around the lake, they saw Montcalm's soldiers guarding it. "Fort William Henry is under siege," whispered Duncan. Suddenly, in front of them, they heard a soldier say, "Who are you? Where are you going?" Duncan answered in French, "We are loyal subjects of France on our way to General Montcalm." "Pass in the name of the king," answered the soldier as they passed. After a few minutes, they heard a noise behind them, and Chingachgook arrived. He was cleaning his knife. Duncan was horrified. "Was it necessary to kill that soldier?" he asked. "We have passed safely." "Yes, it was necessary," said Hawkeye. "If he had reported that a group passed on its way to Montcalm, someone would have started to look for us." They had to continue around the lake to the northern side to get close to the fort. The area in front of the gates was lit by the cannon fire of the French forces. They waited until night. Then, under the cover of darkness and in the confusion of battle, Hawkeye took his group along the path to the walls of the fort. They walked silently in the shadows until they were close to the gates. Inside, they could hear the cries of people in pain and the sounds of the soldiers preparing to come out and fight the French. They banged on the doors of the fort. "Father! Father!" called Alice. "Save your daughters!" Colonel Monroe recognized his daughter's voice and shouted, "Open the gates for my children!" The colonel embraced his two daughters. "My children! My dearest girls! You are safe!" he cried. There was chaos inside the fort. Some people were trying to help soldiers who were hurt. Others were carrying buckets of sand and water to extinguish fires caused by the French cannons. The small group was given the best possible welcome under the circumstances. Then, the two sisters were taken to their father's room. Duncan, Hawkeye, Uncas, and Chingachgook ate a little food and then joined the soldiers of the 60th Regiment to help defend the fort. In the days that followed, the French, under the command of General Montcalm, increased their attacks on the fort. Colonel Monroe wrote to General Webb at Fort Edward again and again, asking for more soldiers, but he did not receive a reply. Colonel Monroe did not know if General Webb was receiving his letters. Eventually, Hawkeye said he would take a letter to the other fort. 2 days later, the French captured Hawkeye and led him to Fort William Henry with his hands tied. Hawkeye entered the fort and spoke to Colonel Monroe. "Montcalm's soldiers took me prisoner," he said. "They took a letter that General Webb gave me for you. Now Montcalm wants to meet you outside the fort." Colonel Monroe called for Duncan at once and told him what Hawkeye had said. "Duncan," said Colonel Munro, "I want you to meet Montcalm and listen to his demands. Then return and report to me." Duncan and a few soldiers went out later to meet General Montcalm. They were carrying a white flag of truce. When they reached the meeting place, Duncan was surprised to see the Indian, Magua, standing beside the French general. Duncan and Montcalm exchanged polite greetings. They talked for a few moments and tried to confuse one another about the size and strength of their forces. Eventually, Montcalm said, "I have enjoyed meeting you, Major Hayward, but my final terms can only be discussed with the commander of your fort. Please tell Colonel Munro that I wish to meet him face to face. I assure you that his safety will be respected. You have my word as a gentleman and as a soldier of France." Duncan returned to the fort and went immediately to Colonel Munro's room. Alice and Cora were with their father. As Duncan entered, both the colonel's daughters left so that the men could speak privately. Duncan received a shy smile from Alice as she passed him. "Tell me your news in a moment, Duncan," said the colonel. "First, I believe that you have wanted to speak to me about something else ever since you returned to the fort, haven't you?" "Indeed, sir," said Duncan hesitantly. "I did not dare to speak of it sooner because of the terrible situation in which we all find ourselves, but I have wanted to marry your daughter for a very long time." "Have you spoken to Cora about this? Does she know how you feel, and does she return your love?" asked Colonel Munro. "Cora, sir? You are wrong. It is Alice that I love." "Is my elder daughter not good enough for you, then?" Colonel Munro replied. "Please do not reject her because of her looks. She is a kind woman, and also very brave." "Her looks, sir?" asked Duncan. "What do you mean?" "Well, she doesn't look like other English girls," said Munro. "Her skin is dark because her mother was from the West Indies. I used to live there, you know. Cora's mother died a few years after Cora was born, so I returned to England and married again. Alice was born soon afterwards, but her mother also died while giving birth to her." "It is a sad story, and I am sorry to hear it," said Duncan. "But please believe me, sir, I have nothing against Cora. She is a good and beautiful woman. It is simply that I love your younger daughter." "Then you have my permission to marry Alice, and I welcome you to the family as my son," said the colonel, putting his hand on Duncan's shoulder. "Now this business with Montcalm. What does he say?" "He says that only you can negotiate with him," said Duncan, "and he promises you safe passage from and to the fort." "I do not trust these Frenchmen," Colonel Munro said, "but I suppose there is no choice. I will meet him tomorrow. Arrange the time and the place, Duncan." The following day, Colonel Munro and Duncan led a small troop of soldiers out of the front gate of Fort William Henry. General Montcalm and a troop of his own men came to meet them. Montcalm spoke first. "I am honored, monsieur, to have the pleasure of your company. You have already done everything possible for your country's honor. However, you cannot resist any more. We only need to wait until more soldiers arrive from General Webb," replied Colonel Munro. "Here is his answer to your request for troops," said Montcalm. He gave Munro the letter he had taken from Hawkeye on the previous day. "You will see that he has no intention of sending any more troops." Colonel Munro took the letter from Montcalm and read it quickly. As he read, his hand began to tremble. He turned to Duncan and said, "General Webb says that he has no more troops to send to us. He recommends that we surrender the fort." "The letter must be a clever forgery," exclaimed Duncan as Colonel Munro gave him the letter. Duncan examined the letter carefully, then said sadly, "But it is Webb's signature. There is no deception." "The man has betrayed me," exclaimed Colonel Munro. "Please, listen to my terms," continued Montcalm. "I must destroy the fort. I have no choice. You and your men, however, may leave with your guns and your own flags. Everything will be done to arrange an honorable retreat." Colonel Munro said slowly, "Go with General Montcalm, Duncan, and make the necessary arrangements to surrender the fort." Chapter 8. The Surrender of the Fort. The night before the final surrender of Fort William Henry, the entrance of General Montcalm's tent opened, and the general walked out into the night. The guards around the camp saluted as he passed them. Montcalm walked into the forest and stood looking at the fort. After a few moments, Magua appeared beside him. Montcalm turned to Magua and asked, "Why did you want this meeting?" Magua answered angrily, "We Hurons do not make friends with the enemy as you palefaces have done. My people want to take the scalps of their enemies." "Those are fighting words," said Montcalm. "But remember, you yourself once fought on the side of the English." "That was long ago," Magua answered. "The sun rises on a new day, and Magua follows the sun." "I know that you have great power with your people," Montcalm continued. "Prove you are a great chief. Teach your people how to treat the English. They are going to leave the fort, so they are not our enemies anymore." "I took up the tomahawk to cover it with blood. I will only bury it when it is red with blood," Magua replied angrily. "The enemies of France must be your enemies, and the friends of France must be your friends," said the general. Magua turned his back and pulled off his cotton shirt to reveal the scars on his back. "Do you know what these are?" he demanded. "You have been badly hurt. Who did this to you?" asked Montcalm. "The English. They whipped me. I will never make peace with the English," shouted Magua. Then he turned and went into the forest. General Montcalm looked out across the lake, deep in thought. Then he shook his head, pulled his cape around him, and returned to his tent. The sun rose the next morning on the troops and settlers preparing to leave Fort William Henry. The wounded soldiers and settlers were put into wagons. The settlers carried a few possessions. Colonel Munro walked silently among them. Duncan Hayward approached him and asked, "Sir, is there anything that I can do?" "Help my daughters," said the colonel. "Yes, sir," said Duncan. He turned quickly and went to see what he could do to assist Cora and Alice. Cora looked very worried, and Alice's eyes were red from crying. They were both relieved to see Duncan. Duncan told them, "Your father and I must ride in front with the troops as we leave the fort, but I will find someone to accompany the two of you." Duncan wanted to say more to comfort Alice, but it was almost time to leave the fort, so he only turned to her and said, "Alice, when we are on our way, I will come to join you." At that moment, they heard David Gamut singing as he moved among the crowd. Duncan interrupted him. "David, please will you accompany Cora and Alice on the march from the fort?" he asked. "All the officers must ride with the troops, and somebody has to stay with these ladies." "I will be happy to do it," said David, and he took his place beside the sisters. As the signal to move was given, Cora, Alice, and David walked out of the fort surrounded by the settlers. Montcalm's soldiers stood respectfully on both sides of the road as the settlers followed the troops through the gates. A total of 3,000 men, women, and children left the fort. A large crowd of Iroquois stood further along the road. Cora saw Magua among them, speaking first to one and then to another. Suddenly, an Iroquois went to a woman with a baby and tried to take the woman's bag. The woman held onto it tightly, so the Iroquois grabbed the baby instead. The woman tried to exchange the bag for the child, but the Iroquois turned and hit the baby's head against a rock. Women all around began screaming. At the same moment, Magua raised his hand to his mouth and let out a war cry to signal an attack. 2,000 Iroquois came screaming out of the forest and attacked the helpless settlers. Blood flowed onto the ground and death was everywhere. The colonel's daughters stood terrified as the attack began. At one moment, Alice saw her father in the crowd and called out to him, "Father, save us or we are lost!"